I'm really, really excited to share some tangible examples of how we might actually design for this emergence that we've been talking about today. I'm going to share a lot of stories. I hope some of them are relevant both personally and professionally, and I'll share some links actually through the course of this through my Twitter handle that you can see here. We've already heard some great explanations of what emergence is. I think it's also important to talk about the context that we live in to understand why it's so important. Now, I'm sure I'm not alone. I think the world is getting more and more complicated. It's becoming less and less predictable. It's harder to look at today's events or last week's events and predict forward and figure out what the hell is going to happen. It's incredibly tough. It's disconcerting. The world's almost accelerating away from us. Now, in that world, it's going to be hard to plan. It's common sense. There were people that actually had jobs, there may be some here, called planners. What a terrifying thing to have to do in this context. The opportunity for us to plan and predict is going to disappear as the world accelerates and gets more complex. And instead, I think we're going to have to create environments where beautiful things emerge, where the stuff you heard earlier, whether it be products, brands, services, or our own careers, will emerge from the chaos. So for me, emergence is exactly that. It's the idea that we can take this noisy, complex environment and beautiful things, order will emerge, and we can actually foster an environment to increase the chance that the stuff that does emerge is good. And then secondly, that we'll be able to grab onto those opportunities when they happen. So specifically, I'm going to share 4 ways that I think we all, whether it be professionally or alternatively personally, can kind of design to have this good stuff emerge in the complicated world. So let's kick off with the first. And this is an idea that I think we're going to need to accelerate evolution. So if you think through what we saw and what we just talked about, the world's getting more complex, it's changing faster and faster. Human needs are changing faster than they ever have done before, whether it be because of the financial crisis or technology. The stuff we want to achieve, or the way we achieve it, is going to be shifting faster than it ever has done before. Now, with that in mind, we need to make stuff and develop the great stuff faster so that we're addressing real needs. We don't want to be late to the party with a solution when everyone has changed. So we can accelerate evolution to make that happen. I think there's some good examples out there of how this can happen. So here's one. In 1991, an amazing guy called Linus Torvalds sent this message. Now, some of you may know this is the birth of Linux, the operating system. It's been unbelievably successful. It's in our wristwatches, it's in some mobile phones, it's in many computers, it powers the servers of Twitter, Amazon, incredibly successful. Now, he wrote this in 1991 and he thought of it as a, low-cost, kind of amateurish operating system, and he released it to the world. He made it open source. In other words, we can take it, we can adapt it, and in theory, we can push it back. Now, open source has been around, I would imagine, pretty much since the sort of, we first walked on the planet. You can think of cooking recipes as an example of open source. But Linux is one of the first examples of open source powered by the internet. And if you look at the launch in 1991, what you started to see is tens of thousands of people have taken the kernel code and adapted them, and they've evolved Linux in parallel. Now, in the past, had Linus done this on his own, it would have been linear. But isn't linear so limiting? It's going to be too slow. Technology now allows us to parallel evolve different solutions, to test variants simultaneously. And whenever they're successful, they get absorbed back into the Linux kernel. A new version is released every 3 months. Now, this is kind of logical to us. It's sort of intuitive. It makes sense that technology would actually power this. I'm really excited about how this is starting to happen in other stuff as well, including product. So an example, I think, is the impact that we're going to see around us from 3D printing. So you all, I'm sure, are aware of 3D printers, the idea that you can literally print usually a plastic or a polymer and build up a physical object, often with machines. This is a great example. This is a MakerBot phenomenal example of just this. You assemble the kit yourself. They're only about £1.5 grand. Phenomenal thing just to have at home. Everyone will have one of these in the future. Now, to give you an example, there's a really inspiring guy that we know, actually, a guy called Brendan Dawes that you might be familiar with. So Brendan's a cracking, really good interaction designer, but he's blessed with a skill that I think is essential in this complicated, complex world, and that is curiosity. He's interested in stuff, and he decided that he'd be interested in learning about 3D printing. He wanted to know how to do that. Now, in the past, you would just kind of read the book and you wouldn't necessarily build anything. He took a different approach. He thought, to learn about 3D printing, first I have to model. And he used Google SketchUp. So he thought, instead of just modeling any old thing, I want to do something useful. I'll make something useful. I'll actually build this from scratch. I'll learn how to use Google SketchUp. And he built this. It's an attachment to an iPhone that enables you to have a really lovely, big, satisfying button so that you can take a picture. That was his idea. He was scratching his own itch in the same way as Linux developers were scratching their own itches when they created tens of thousands of variants. Now, the interesting thing is, instead of then just working in a linear fashion and producing this and then slowly building the next version, he took a different approach. And that approach was afforded to him because of 3D printing. And he built loads of variants simultaneously. He was parallel evolving a product in this case. And we'll see this more and more. A lovely anecdote I still love is the weird radii in these. And actually, you can see it on the previous slide as well. That's only a function of the fact that he couldn't figure out how to do it in Google SketchUp and have it smoother. So part of this process of learning, hacking, parallel developing, he evolved a great product faster than he would have before. And there's actually great other sort of product examples we can come to. If you're interested, you can see his website where the actual product now, after testing the market on Kickstarter, is available. But, you know, there's sites, there's platforms that even mirror Linux with real products even more closely. So an example is Thingiverse, amazing site where tens of thousands of people have uploaded product images, product details, CAD representation. And what I love to see is people upload these, but then people build derivatives. It branches. You see the same parallel evolution going on. So you can see here, these are 2,600 of the newest derivatives on this site. It's almost infinite branching. It has to be accelerating evolution. I love the fact that a lot of these that you see up here are ways to improve the 3D printers themselves. It's almost recursive. It's like it's sort of growing itself. It's incredibly organic. Like more and more, this evolution, parallel development, starts to look like natural selection. We're not linear, we're parallel developing. And that feels difficult to do, but I love the door wedge analogy. You just need to do something to start and grow from there. And the challenge, it's really easy to talk, but tough to act. So we have to start, and then we can accelerate evolution. So the second idea I'd love to share, if you imagine this sort of biological metaphor and you want real variance in the system, you want all of this different stuff to grow, the only thing that's going to inhibit that is constraints in the system. It's common sense. Now, we should never get rid of constraints altogether. I'm not suggesting that, but we should be really mindful of them. So there's an example that I find inspiring, and that is the development of mobile phones. Now, if you look at these, to me, partly because the keys were becoming smaller and more fixed in terms of their purpose, I think these were becoming more constrained over time. Mobile phones were restricting our ingenuity. They were cramming more and more crap on the keypad, and it was stopping our ability to do different stuff, or at least to hack different solutions. And for me, that's one of the most game-changing things that the iPhone and I guess also the iPad changed. They're blank canvases. They took away the constraint of the keys. Now, that's not to say that they don't have constraints in their system. They do, but they were smart to take away that constraint and enable all of our ingenuity to come up with solutions that you never could have had in these other devices. You couldn't have one of these acting as a heart rate monitor easily. You couldn't hack one of these to make it a vuvuzela or a spirit level or something. It couldn't happen. So they created a blank canvas. We should consider constraints in our environments if we want great stuff to emerge. Don't remove constraints altogether, but be really mindful of them. And I think this is true of our careers as well. I'm always petrified when I see things like job descriptions when everything we do is prescribed. Like, don't expect to have good stuff emerge if you're told at 9:01 to have a cup of coffee, 9:02 to fill in the spreadsheet, and 9:04 to do something else. There's going to be no emergence in that system. We have to put oxygen in our lives for inspiration and to let this good stuff happen. Now, the third idea I wanted to share is the idea that actually, in this world where we don't really know what we don't know, and I guess we don't really know what we want to happen, we have to create connections. We have to create networks. And serendipity, or luck if you want to call it that, will fall out of these networks. Now, I think this applies to both human networks, but also data networks. Now, human's obvious. We all understand that. This is a plot of my LinkedIn. These are all my connections in LinkedIn. So on the left you have Harvard, on the right you have IDEO. I think it's kind of fascinating they're the opposite end of the spectrums. I think we sort of inferred that at the beginning. And in between you've got tech and startups. Now what's interesting to me is that this network has incredible potential energy in it. It has incredible stored up value. Now we don't value it, and I'm not suggesting you should value it avariciously. I'm not suggesting that you should run out there and sign up as many people for LinkedIn as possible. That's meaningless. I am suggesting that these connections of eclectic people will create value in your lives, and more importantly, you should create value in these networks by erring on the side of openness, and that in itself holds huge value. An example is probably 3 weekends ago at IDEO, we ran a makeathon. Now, in the past, you've all heard of hackathons. Generally, it's just hackers. We ran a makeathon where we brought together a similarly sort of eclectic set of people. So we brought together designers, entrepreneurs, branding, business designers, interaction designers, hackers as well. And we set some challenges. We didn't know what would come out. We didn't know the serendipitous things that would come out of that. But we saw some incredible outcomes after just 36 hours. This is an example. A team tasked with just thinking about cycle safety after 36 hours had designed this. It's a product, it's a proximity sensor that attaches to your bike, and if a car comes too close behind you, you get this frowning face. It signals to them. We didn't predict this stuff. This is the latent value of networks. And I think, although it's probably a bigger stretch, that what's true of kind of human networks, our personal connections, is also true of connecting data, and it'll be more and more true in the future. So this is an interesting example. Like if you guys, after this, decided to go on the Eurostar, head over to Paris, you could use Google's aggregate data to figure out where the best place in France to go to avoid the flu would be. So you'd probably want to avoid the Champagne-Ardenne region up here on the right, although it's kind of fun for other reasons. Now, interestingly, Google had collected this data. They didn't have a specific hypothesis. They didn't say, we're collecting searches around flu symptoms because we want to predict flu. They let it grow out of the network. They let it grow out of connecting disparate data sources. So I think we need to start thinking through how we can capture data, particularly since it's all pervasive. We all leave data trails, and the cost of storing that data is converging towards zero. So on that basis, we need to start thinking through collecting data and smashing it together in interesting ways without really understanding what the value is yet. That value will emerge from the system. And I think that this will be true of personal data as well. So this one's a real stretch, but it's worth watching this.
I've been living with this girl about a year. We're very close. We spend 24/7 together. We're just, we're tight. We're intimate and everything.
How do you know her?
She's my cousin.
It's terrifying. And now you'll see why this is a real stretch, this one. There's a gentleman, a really amazing man actually, who 30 years ago, his name's Seth Roberts, 30 years ago, he had insomnia, he had acne, he was overweight, and he decided to dedicate his time to being a personal experiment. He was one of the first. We all see this a lot now. It's more and more common because of devices, but he was one of the first people to do it. And he spent 30 years tracking his own data, his behavior, and seeing what he learned. And one of the fantastic things for me, he's now written best-selling books about sort of diets, etc., because he discovered interesting things. But one of the weirder things that he found is if he spent an hour each morning looking at talking heads on TV, no matter what they were, he would be much happier for the rest of the day. So I'm hoping even this applies to Jerry Springer and you guys will just feel a little more uplifted for the rest of the day on the back of this. But I think what's interesting there, he looked back to the Stone Age to try and understand it, and he decided that actually we were all collective and sort of familial early in the morning. We'd chat probably about, you know, what animal we were going to hopefully kill that day. But by the evening, it had gone dark and we'd all passed out or something. So this had a real reason that he could see, but he would never have discovered it had he not been tracking his own life. And interestingly, that was a real pain for him to do. I'm not recommending we all do that. You wouldn't achieve much else. But interesting, there's tools, there's products that are enabling us to do it. This is one I find really interesting. This is the Jawbone Up, which actually tethers with an iPhone app, and it monitors your movement, and it'll give you advice, prompts of how to sleep better, how to eat better, how to exercise better. This is about connecting data, our personal data, but also our professional data. And soon, I think we'll start to see you'll be able to pump this data into services and systems that will tell you why it's interesting. You won't even need to have a hypothesis. Now, Seth Roberts would have to base it, or in the past, Seth Roberts would have had to have said, I think there might be a correlation between how happy I am and how much TV I watched in the morning, and ask the system. Now, systems exist that would take that data and say, did you know, Seth, these two things are correlated. Wolfram Alpha Pro is a really interesting emerging example of that. So I've talked about the importance of accelerating innovation, considering constraints so that we let the variance happen, making sure we see the potential value in forming connections. I think if you combine those things, you will see opportunities, wonderful things emerge. And this really, I genuinely believe this is true professionally and also personally. The final one, and obviously I think will be the mark of those of us that really benefit in this world, will be grabbing those opportunities. They're going to appear all around us. We need to make sure that we absolutely grab them. To give you an example, sort of bring that to life, many of you will recognize this. This is PlayDoh. So it wasn't called PlayDoh originally. It was actually created in the 1930s by a wallpaper company, and they thought it was a really clever wallpaper cleaner. Now, this poor dude spent pretty much his whole career peddling that. It was luckily not all they did. His son, 30 years later, said, why don't we use this for kids? It's a fun putty they can eat. And PlayDoh was born. It makes me wonder how many of lovely applications, new user benefits would have arisen in that intervening time. It's just that they never saw it. It was only the son that saw it. One generation it took. Contrast that with Sugru. Sugru, many of you know, it was done by a postgrad student at the RCA. So it's actually a self-hardening sort of silicon variant, so it looks and feels a bit like Play-Doh. The difference is this business is designed for emergence. It's designed without knowing all of the applications. So instead of Play-Doh that just pushed it out there and waited to see what happened, these guys are actually building in discovery of use cases. They're building in discovery of emerging opportunities. So if you revisit their website, it'll show you huge amounts of sort of eclectic ways you can use Sugru. And similarly, there's some really important stuff in there, like the idea of actually making your own Angry Birds cable holders. So it's not all just sort of frivolous. And actually, you don't need to create a whole business system that just takes up these new business ideas. You can just watch. We've heard some wonderful anecdotes this morning just about watching and listening and learning. Like we run a platform, IDEO, called OpenIDEO, which is kind of an open innovation network for solving challenges for social good. Our whole team is permanently close to our users, and we learn to watch emerging behaviors. So an example that inspires me actually is a wonderful lady on the left you can see here called Tracy Brandenburg in the States. She started using OpenIDEO as a teaching tool. We watched that happen, we spoke with her, we learnt her needs, and subsequently we've launched a toolkit for educators. So staying close to your users. You don't even need to absorb them all back, but stay close and watch emerging use cases. Watch them develop. And sometimes, just occasionally, you'll even see it in social media. I get really excited about examples like this. And this is actually an old one, but I think it speaks to it really well. So some of you will remember this. This is from 2006. It's a really, really interesting example. A business, it was actually just a sort of creative group called EP Bird, were the first ones to basically start exploring slinging Mentos in soda, Diet Coke in this case. And as you can see, it's pretty catastrophic, the sort of stuff they can do. What was interesting to me is they actually took a video of this, they put it up online, and within the first day, after sharing it with no one except one of the founders' brothers, they'd had 14,000 views. Next, they started to see everyone replicating this. There was, I think it's within 9 months, there were 20,000 examples of people doing this stuff online. Suddenly, a new use case for soda and Mentos had appeared. And you started to see people searching. So back to our point about data, this is Google Trends. This is the aggregate of people searching for stuff. And you can see an unbelievable spike when the video came out of people searching for Coke in blue, obviously a net higher amount of search, and then Mentos and obviously the combination. What was fascinating to me in this case is if you looked at it again a year after the event, Mentos sales had increased by 20%. But fascinatingly, 3 years after, they were still up 15% on the original. So something happened here where suddenly Mentos became in the sort of forefront of our minds. And if you look at that story, the reason I think it's still relevant, even though it's a while ago, is we can look back. And one of the smartest things Mentos did is they contacted these guys within a week and said, we support you. We're completely up for this use of Mentos. How can we help? How can we share it? How can we learn? And I love looking for other examples. A final one I'll share, because I'm excited that it may actually become one of these, is the really interesting uses that we're seeing spring up in the maker movement around Altoids tins. So Altoids tins been around for ages. This is actually one Brendan Dawes did. It's actually a USB charger for your phone. The maker movement love Altoids tins because they're a really convenient little box. And I wonder whether Altoids are smart enough to be seeing this. I wonder whether the company is sitting back saying, I know we're really serious about mints, but maybe the case is now more important. So I wonder if we'll see them monitoring social media. So just to conclude, you can accelerate evolution. It creates variance. You have parallel development. You have to consider constraints because constraints can restrict what you create. You should connect, create networks of data and people because they will become valuable, not just to you, more importantly, they will become valuable. So be part of it, share with the networks, and finally, grab the opportunities as they arise by listening and watching. Thank you so much.